I want to talk about R factors. We talked about F factors. F factors are plasmids that code for conjugation, right? R factors are plasmids with resistance genes. And there are two components on these plasmids. There's a resistance transfer factor and there's an R determinant. Okay. Now, what I mean by resistance genes, I'm talking about resistance to antibiotics, resistance to other kinds of environmental stresses like heavy metals or cellular toxins. Now, the two different components of these R factors are, so the resistance transfer factor encodes production of enzymes involved in plasmid replication and conjugation. Okay, so this is the part that's going to be shared by F factors. F factors have this also. So resistance transfer factor encodes conjugation, sex pili and other enzymes involved in moving the R factor around, moving this plasmid from bacteria to other bacteria. The R determinant includes the resistance genes. And there can be one resistance gene to one environmental stress. There could be lots of resistance genes. Now, I want to give you an example of an R factor that is important for modern medicine. Now remember, this is a plasmid. This is a plasmid that encodes, that codes for conjugation. This plasmid is not associated with only one species of bacteria. It's an endosymbiont. It's a non-living symbiont. It is a separate, it's a rogue genetic element, sort of like a virus, that moves from bacteria to bacteria. When it's inside a bacteria, because it's made of DNA, it gives that bacteria new properties because the bacteria uses the genetic instructions that are added to the cell in the plasmid. But it's not under the control of the cell. It moves from species to species on its own. So the plasmid that's really important to modern medicine, or one plasmid very important to modern medicine, is called R100. You find this R factor, this plasmid, in enteric bacteria. That means in gut bacteria, so in your intestines. This plasmid has resistance genes, or R determinants, that gives the bacteria carrying this plasmid resistance to all these different kinds of antibiotics and also to heavy metals like mercury. So there's all of these different resistance genes encoded on this plasmid. Any bacteria that has this plasmid is going to be resistant to all of these things. It's got all these resistance genes on it. This plasmid, like I said, it gets moved through conjugation from bacteria to bacteria. Now this might seem great that it's in your gut bacteria, right? That means the bacteria in your gut, if you have this plasmid in your gut bacteria, they're going to be resistant to all of these antibiotic treatments. And isn't one of the worst things about antibiotics that it clears your good bacteria from your gut? That's why you get tummy upset and stuff. So if your gut bacteria is all resistant to antibiotics, to all these antibiotics, that means you get to keep your good bacteria when you take an antibiotic, right? The problem is your gut bacteria are not in control of who they give this gene to. They're not in control of where this plasmid goes. So the problem is when you get infected by a pathogen, your good gut bacteria can engage in conjugation with the pathogen and give the pathogen this plasmid, the R100 plasmid. That gives the pathogen resistance to all of these things. And it turns out studies now show that the greatest reservoir of antibiotic resistance genes for pathogens is from the good bacteria in your gut. That's usually where the pathogens are getting those genes. Yes, once in a while they mutate and acquire a resistance gene on their own, but remember, not very many bacteria are pathogens. Most bacteria that you encounter are beneficial or commensal. They're mutualists or commensals. So that you have trillions of microbes living inside you. And if they're developing resistance, and that resistance is moving from plasmids into the pathogens, that's where the problem is. Okay. So R100 includes many resistance genes and can be passed among a number of intestinal bacteria, for example, between E. coli, Salmonella, and Klebsiella. So we talked about how E. coli is usually good, although there are some pathogenic strains. But then there's also Salmonella and Klebsiella, which are just pathogens, and they can pick up, they pass through your gut and they pick up antibiotic resistance from gut bacteria if they engage in conjugation.